Brochos, page 2, side A, the end of the page. We're in the midst of discussing when do Kohanim eat Terumah after they have been impure. When would be the earliest time that they would be permitted to eat Terumah? So we're talking about a Kohen that became impure, whether he touched a dead body, or he had some type of had leprosy, or he had some type of emission, different types of impurities that would cause a Kohen to be impure. And after he's impure, he needs to go to the mikvah. The mikvah must be done first, and after the mikvah, he needs the sun to set. Now, certain impurities, a kohen also has to bring sacrifices. There are sacrifices that a kohen brings after he finishes certain impurities. Not all. Some impurities he's done. He goes to the mikvah, the sun sets, the stars come out, he's finished, he's pure. Other impurities, he needs to wait for the, go to mikvah, sun sets, stars come out, and he has to bring sacrifices the next day. Now, the sacrifices that he brings cannot be brought after he goes to the mikvah that night. It has to be, you have to wait till the daytime to bring those sacrifices. And our Mishnah told us that the time to say the evening Shema is the same time that the Kohen can eat Terumah. So what we see here is that a Kohen, even if he must bring sacrifices, he will not need to wait to bring those sacrifices in order to eat Terumah, but instead he can already eat Terumah once he does the first two steps of the three-step process. So again, a Kohen has a three-step process. He's got to go to mikvah, he's got to wait for the day to end, which means the sun sets and the stars come out. And then the third step is the bringing the sacrifices the next day. Two of those steps are important for him to eat Terumah. He needs to go to mikvah, and the sun sets and the day ends, the stars come out. That's all he needs. Even though he didn't bring the sacrifices, he would be allowed to eat Terumah already at night. Now, he's not allowed to eat sacrificial meats yet because he's still partially impure. Mechusar Kippurim, that's the term used. He's missing his atonement. So because he's missing atonement, he's prohibited from eating sacrificial meats, even though Kohanim are the ones who are allowed to eat a number of the sacrificial meats, a number of the sacrifices. The Kohanim are given certain portions from, not a korban oila. Korban oila is completely burned, but there are sacrifices, the other sacrifices, that there's a portion for the Kohen, and the Kohen would not be allowed to eat those sacrifices until he brings his atonement the next day after the mikvah and after the sunset and the stars came out. So we're going to now start at the two dots. We're about 9 lines up from the bottom of the page. Amar Mar, Master said. Master said means we mentioned earlier. You just said, Misha'a she'hakoyanim nichnasim, from the time that the Kohanim enter, le'achol b'trumasan, to eat in their truma, that's the time that you can recite Shema. That's the earliest time to recite the Shema. That's what our Mishnah said. Michti. Let's see. Kohanim emas, the Kohanim, the priests, emas ka'achli truma. When do they eat the Terumah? When are they allowed, after their impurity, when are they allowed to eat the Terumah? Mishas Tzeis HaKochavim, from the time that the stars come out. That is the proper time that the Kohanim can eat the Terumah. So the Gemara asks, Listni, let the Mishnah teach, Mishas Tzeis HaKochavim, that the earliest time to say the Shema is when the stars come out. Why does the Mishnah give us a cryptic time? When you're allowed to say the earliest time you could say the Shema is the time that the Kohanim are allowed to eat the Terumah if they were impure. Why can't you just tell me straight out when the stars come out? Wouldn't that be much clearer? And the Gemara says that Milsa Agav Urche Kamash Balan, that you're right, it could have really said Tzeis HaKochavim when the stars come out. But it tells us a matter along the way, additional point. It's good to know. It's like extra, but it mentions it. It lets us hear an extra point. Milsa Agav Urche Kamash Malan, a matter along the way, it lets us hear that Kohanim Emas Ka'ochli B'Truma, when do Kohanim eat the Truma, Mishas Tzeis HaKochavim, from the time of Tzeis HaKochavim, V'ha Kamash Malan, and this lets us hear the Kapara Loy Ma'akva, that the atonement is not preventing them from eating Truma. What is the atonement? It means the sacrifices. That means that even a kohen that needs to bring sacrifices, his atonement sacrifices will not prevent him from eating truma. And even though he didn't yet bring those sacrifices, instead he's going to bring those the next morning, but he's allowed already now to eat the truma as long as the stars came out, as long as he went to mikvah before the sun set and then the sun set afterwards and the stars came out. He's now going to be allowed to eat truma. And then tomorrow he'll bring those sacrifices. And then after he brings those sacrifices, he will be allowed to eat, partake from the sacrificial meats. And the Gemara now says, Kidetanya, like we learned in a brisa. So there is a brisa that teaches us this law, that a kohen doesn't have to wait to bring his sacrifices in order to eat truma. Instead, he's allowed to eat truma right after the sun sets and the stars come out. That's when he would be allowed to eat truma, as long as he went to mikvah during the day. Now, the kohen is impure, and while he was impure, he was not allowed to partake of truma. Truma is a portion that was given to the kohen from a person's produce. So, for example, their grain, their wine, their oil, they would give a percentage. Truma was like 1/50th, one out of every 50 barrels you would give to the kohen. Now, if a person's generous, it says they would give 1/40th. If a person was stingy, they would give 1/60th. So there are three numbers for how much a kohen gets. It's either 1/60th, 1/50th, or 1/40th. And the kohen that would be truma. It would be called truma. Truma is this tithing, so to speak, and it needed to be eaten with purity. You were not allowed to touch the truma if you were impure, because you would disqualify it and ruin it. And this is called holy. The truma has a certain holiness to it, and an Israelite is definitely not allowed to eat from the truma. And so the truma needed to be eaten only when a kohen was pure. And so that's why a kohen had to go to mikvah, and then they had to wait for the sun to set and the stars to come out, and then the kohen would be allowed to eat truma. And the brisa says as follows: Kidetanya, as we learned in a brisa, uva hashemesh v'toher. The verse in Vayikra in Leviticus says that the sun sets v'toher and it goes by. Now, what does that mean? So we are understanding it that the sun sets and the day finishes. V'toher. The sun sets and the day finishes, meaning the stars came out. And it says, and afterwards the verse continues, and it says, afterwards he's allowed to partake of holies. And the understanding of the Talmud is that that refers to Terumah holies, not sacrificial holies, but Terumah holies. He's allowed to partake of them after the sun sets and the day ends, the day goes. Bias Shimshay Ma'akavtoi Milechol B'Terumah, the Brisa continues and it says, the coming down of the sun, the setting of the sun, is what prevents him Milechol B'Terumah, from eating Terumah. But his atonement doesn't prevent him from eating Terumah. And the atonement meant the sacrifices. That doesn't prevent him from eating Terumah. So that's the end of the Brisa. And now the Gemara asks, how do we know that when it says the sun sets, it means bias hashemesh, the sun setting? Because literally the word, it comes, the sun comes. What does come mean? Does it mean it rises or does it mean it sets? So how do we know it means it sets? And then the word v'toher would mean that the day goes, the day ends, and it would mean when stars come out. Dilma, now we just turn the page. Dilma bias oirayu. Maybe it means that when the sun comes means when the sunlight arrives, when the morning, the sun rises. And maybe bias oirayu. It's when the light comes, when the sun rises. Umay v'toher tahar gavra. And what does it mean? And he is pure, he is purified. V'toher, it means tahar gavra, that the person will bring his sacrifices. And afterwards, he will be allowed to partake of the holies. Then he would be allowed to eat Terumah. So maybe if you want to translate the verse, maybe it should be translated to mean that a kohen that was impure, he's not allowed to eat Terumah until after he brings the sacrifices the next day. And you could fit that into the words also, that the sun rises and v'toher, and the man purifies himself with the sacrifices, and afterwards he's allowed to eat Terumah. So you could read that into the verse as well. So how do you know the verse means this? Maybe it means that. How does the Brisa know it? And the Gemara concludes, and it says, Amar Rabba bar Rav Shila, Rabba bar, the son of Rav Shila, says, Im Kain, if it meant that the man has to purify himself with sacrifices, Lema Krav Yitar, let the verse say, and he purifies himself. He has to do an action. It should use a more active verb rather than v'toher, and it ends, and it's purified. It should say, and he purifies himself, because he's the one who must bring the sacrifices. So let the verse say v'yitar. My v'toher, the fact that the verse says v'toher, not v'yitar, v'toher means tahar yoima, the day ends, which means that the stars come out. And so that's when he's allowed to eat Terumah, at night when the stars come out. Kid Imri Inchi, like people say, Iyar of Shimshav yoima, the sun sets and the day passes. B'ma'arava, in the west, had the Rabbah, now in the west means in Israel. Now the Talmud was written, this Talmud is the Babylonian Talmud, it was written in Babylonia, which today would be Iraq. And whenever the Talmud says Ma'arava, it means in the west, means in Israel. So in Israel, they had the same question. Had the Rabba bar Rav Shila lo yishmi'alahu. They didn't know of Rabba, the son of Rav Shila's answer. They didn't hear of it. And they had the same question, but they didn't have his answer. Bo la mi boy. And they asked this question. Hi uva hashemesh bias shimshayu. This uva hashemesh, does it mean the sun sets? Umay v'toher tar yoima. And what does v'toher mean? It means the day ends. Oidilma, or maybe bias oirehu. Maybe it means the sun rises and the light comes. And what does v'toher mean? Umay v'toher tar gavra. It means the person purifies himself with his sacrifices. V'hadar pashti la mebraisa, and then they were able to prove it from another brisa, because there is a brisa that it says midatani bebrisa simin ladavar. There is a brisa that says if you want to know a sign when this time is, that you're allowed to recite the earliest Shema. A sign for that is Tzeis HaKochavim, when the stars come out. And that's a sign for when the Kohanim are allowed to eat Terumah. Because the brisa that we're bringing from says the earliest time for Shema is the time that the Kohanim are able to eat Terumah, and that sign for that is the stars coming out. So this sign is really a sign for both. It tells you when the Kohanim can eat Terumah, which is the stars coming out, and that is the time for the earliest time to say Shema. So we just had a question: how do we know that the Kohanim are really allowed to eat Terumah at night? There is a option to maybe learn that the words in the verse refer to the next day after the Kohen brings his sacrifices. That's when he would be allowed to eat Terumah. And the Gemara says, no, we see clearly that it has to mean this because the Brisa says it very clearly. Simin ledavar tzeis hakochavim, a sign for this time is the stars coming out. Shema mina, we hear from this, bias shimshayu, that it means that the sun sets, umay v'toher, tahar yoima. And what does v'toher mean? It means that the day ends with the stars coming out. So that is the translation of this. That's the translation of this Gemara according to Rashi. There is another way of learning this Gemara, and that is that Tosfos is not satisfied with the way Rashi learns it, and Tosfos wants to explain that the Gemara's question is not that we should possibly entertain the thought of the Kohen needing to wait until the next day after he brings his sacrifices to eat Terumah. That wasn't the question of the Gemara. The Gemara was not entertaining such a thought. The question of the Gemara was, is it 3 stars that comes out that you need to wait for in order for the Kohen to eat Terumah? Or is it sunset? Maybe sunset itself is good enough and you don't need to wait for the 3 stars. That's the question of the Gemara. And the way Tosfos fits it into the verse, to the words of the Gemara, he says, how do you know that Uba Hashemesh, the setting of the sun, means the full setting? Until Bias Hashemesh means the sun is completely set and the stars came out and the day is over. Maybe it means that just the beginning of the setting of the sun, which we call sunset, maybe that is the time. And V'toher means Tahar Gavra, the person becomes, the person is now pure once the sun sets, and that would be maybe that's good enough that he would be allowed to eat Terumah once the sun sets, and that's the way Tosfos understands this Gemara. Of course, it's a he has a lot of questions on Rashi, and therefore he wants to translate it this way. And then the Gemara answers the 2 answers that the Gemara gives, that either the wording doesn't fit perfectly, or we have a proof from another brisa that it's the stars coming out.